So I'm going to go ahead and jump in as we have an hour set.
Okay.
It looks like we have a few people coming online, but in all reality, by the time I get through the core opening remarks and we get to your part, Nicole, I think most people will be online. So,
Sure.
all right. So, hey, thank you everyone for attending this morning. I trust you're eager to learn more about common mistakes HR professionals make in government contracting. I know I am. After hosting and listening to so many important and relevant webinars on it who must not be named, I'm sure we get back to like core topics to kind of drive your businesses. So let's get moving as we only have an hour. So this webinar is approved for 1 SHRM credit and 1 HRCI credit. Those certificates will be mailed to attendees later this afternoon. Probably kind of late this afternoon, you should expect to receive those via email from me. As far as format, if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A queue, and we'll address them at the end of this session. This instance does not have chat, so we won't be able to communicate through that feature. If there's a specific question that maybe needs more context, we can always bring somebody live. So while I certainly understand people posting anonymous questions, if you have something that's complex, we're happy to bring you on live for context. So our agenda, I'll provide just some brief opening remarks and my bio. Nicole's going to run through hers. I then I'll hand things over to Nicole. She'll lead us through the next hour. We did leave some time for Q&A at the end. If we need to, we have a little bit of extra time past the 11 o'clock hour to address any unanswered questions, but we should wrap up pretty close to on time. So on to me. So my name is Brian Klickner, and I'm with Risk Strategies. I know from seeing a lot of the attendees' names that people have been on this before, with me, one of these before. So here at Risk Strategies, I have over 1,800 colleagues across 70 offices throughout the U.S. I focus on employee benefits. I've worked for over a decade as an insurance broker, in addition to 5 years as an executive with a Virginia-based government contractor that's a now graduated 8A small business with an emphasis in like the DHS, CBP area, IT kind of strategy. Kind of particular relevance, I like learning more and more about that area, even though I'm not specifically in there now. Here at Risk Strategies, my team and I work with clients to create bespoke employee benefit programs that engage employees, maximize transparency, while controlling and mitigating costs where possible. Whether it's digital enrollment, custom mobile app enabled employee advocacy, or even we're getting into direct contracts with hospital systems and physicians, which then can lead to removing the big 4 insurance carriers from the equation. This really allows for enhanced experience and kind of cost reduction or mitigation. We're doing a lot of these things here today for our clients. Regarding today, I met Nicole a few months back at a SHRM event where she presented on this exact topic. After only a few minutes of her presentation, I knew that I needed to book her to present here in this format and share her time and expertise. She's been really gracious with that. So her knowledge on the kind of the GovCon environment is superior, and I'm eager to learn more from her today. I'll go ahead and stop sharing kind of our landing page for Risk Strategies, and we're going to hand things over to Nicole, and she'll lead us through the next hour.
Hey, guys. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. I am going to attempt to share my screen with you all now as well. So yeah, my name is Nicole Atala. I work as a partner with Polero Mazza PLC. We're located here in DC, but we have offices in Colorado. We have a couple of attorneys in Chicago and an office in Maryland. We are a business law firm. Most of our clients are government contractors, small to mid-sized businesses. And so I have been with them for 11 years now. I was a baby attorney when I started there and had no idea what this government contracting world was. I was an employment attorney out of Atlanta, and it took me probably a good 2 years to start getting the hang of all the acronyms. I was just like, what the heck is going on here? So I certainly sympathize with those of you that are still trying to get a handle on it, because it's a lot. We work with people in addition to labor and employment and prevailing wage law and all things government contracting. You know, we do audits and investigations, business and corporate law. We like to think of ourselves as really strategic partners and trying to solve the problems of our clients. So that's what we're really doing. And we have 31 attorneys that are solely focused on government contractors and government contracting and all angles of that. Like I said, I've been with the firm 11 years. I am traditionally a regular labor and employment attorney. I'm not, wasn't trained as a GovCon attorney, but you quickly learn how important it is that you understand both labor and employment and government contracting if you're gonna live in the world of FAR Part 22. And so what we thought at the beginning of this year when we were thinking about how we wanted to put a program and how we wanted to frame what would be important for you all to know this year, my colleagues and I sat down and we said, you know what, we see these big missteps. Everyone is kind of doing their thing and we're missing the pullback and looking at things kind of from the 10,000-foot view to see where we can stop some of these problems before they even start, so that hopefully you don't have to use as much of my time, as much as I like talking to you. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to look at the various federal labor laws and how those dovetail with government contracting. And we're going to talk about how to avoid some of the most costly mistakes that we see government contractors make in our practice. So the first thing we really want to talk about is getting in how many people, how many players need to be involved at the very, very beginning. So when you're thinking about the life cycle of a contract, it's starting before that proposal goes in. It's starting when you are looking at different opportunities to pursue, what makes sense for your organization to pursue. And at that stage, you know, HR professionals, pricing professionals, C-suite professionals should all be involved in understanding strategically what you want to get out of this effort, right? Because if you pick up a proposal that has a lot of unfamiliar territory, it's a Service Contract Act contract, you've never worked in service contract before. It has a union workforce, you've never worked with a union workforce before. There are going to be costs inherent in setting those things up and making sure you're doing them correctly. And so it's really important that the whole team is on board with that cost outlay and that preparedness outlay. And it may be to your strategic advantage to go after that opportunity, but the last thing you want is your folks, your BD folks going after an opportunity, bringing it in, and you find out that you're going to lose a bunch of money because you have to invest a lot in compliance that you didn't think you'd have to do. You have to go out and get new, you know, retirement plans that fit with your SCA strategy, or you're having to have negotiation costs you never thought you'd have to have. The other thing that you should be keeping in mind is that, you know, pricing and HR have a unique opportunity to really work together to make every opportunity the best opportunity to go after, right? And a lot of times those two component parts aren't talking to each other at the beginning of planning for an effort or going after an effort. So if pricing is looking at a contract and classifies everybody as exempt, salaried under the Fair Labor Standards Act, without talking to HR to understand if they really are exempt or not exempt. And maybe they do that because the last contractor has priced them all as exempt. But unless you understand what hurdles the HR team might be facing, or you understand what their concerns are, you're really not going to be able to properly price that contract. You also might not be able to price savings. So your HR teams, your project management teams, those folks can all really help you understand where you can get some cost savings in your proposal. So it's a really good idea to find some way in your process to bring all of those players together and kind of hear each other out and figure a good way to work together. It also means that you have to really listen to each other because you're going to be coming at this from a totally different angle, right? Everybody's got their thing. And the better you can understand where everybody's coming from, over time, it really, really pays off. The next point I would say is really read your solicitation carefully. There's a lot in there we assume we know because we've seen a gazillion of these. And I am terrible at this sometimes too. I have to remind myself, go back and read exactly what price adjustment clause is in that contract. Go back and read, you know, all the flow downs that need to be in there. because sometimes, more frequently than I would like to admit, there's clauses in there that should be in there that aren't in there. There are requirements in there that are unusual. I've seen solicitations recently that try to work around the FAR with some language in the contract. And if you read that solicitation carefully and you understand where there could be gaps or mistakes in that solicitation, though that's the time pre-offer, pre-bid, that you really need to be looking at that solicitation and talking to the contracting officer or the procurement team about correcting those errors on the front end. So for example, prevailing wage is just easy for me because there are so many mistakes in prevailing wage land. But if you have an SCA contract but there's solicitation and you see these the Service Contract Act clauses in there, but there's no wage determination, you should be handling that way before you bid on this thing. That should be a question that you raise from the outset. It might even warrant a pre-award protest. So it's really important that the team has carefully read that solicitation, identified any solicitation defects, and if the team decides to pre-award protest that, the pre-award protests don't have to be a big thing, by the way. They can just be a letter of correction. They can be done anonymously at first. So there are lots of ways to remedy solicitation defects from the outset if you have one. I mean, let's be honest, mistakes in pricing are very, very costly. If somebody has mistakenly believed that the entire workforce is exempt and you don't have to pay overtime, and then all of a sudden Department of Labor audits and tells you that they're all subject to overtime, you're not going to get that price adjustment from the government, right? So you need to make sure that you're confident that your game plan for pricing isn't so risky. You've priced it to win, but did you price it for some profit? And that's really the question. Unless you've made a strategic decision that it's okay to lose money on an effort, which some companies might do, it's really important that your pricing strategy is not only priced to win, but it's priced to profit. I already talked about communication, so I'm not going to go over that again, but I can't emphasize enough how important it really is to communicate. 9 times out of 10, when I'm asking an HR professional, what happened at the outset of the contract or when you were bidding, I get I have no idea. There's one group that bids on the thing, and then it comes over to me to onboard these people, and that's where we find whether everybody was on the same page. That's really not where you want to be later on. So what's the second big area that I would like you all to start thinking about more is considering state and local laws. That's particularly important right now. States and localities are passing laws very quickly, not just because of the current condition in the world, but because the federal government has been very slow to move on things like sick leave, minimum wage, employee benefit type of considerations. And so states and localities are taking it into their own hands. For example, in this city of San Francisco, there is a requirement that's much like the non-displacement of qualified workers that was a FAR provision, an executive order that was recently repealed by the Trump administration. It was pulled back, and that requirement was to hire the incumbent workforce unless there were certain exceptions. Well, lo and behold, you pick up a contract that's in the San Francisco Bay Area, you still have the requirement. If you didn't have somebody looking there and you did not hire the incumbent workforce, you could be in some hot water, and it can cost you significantly. So it's really important that you understand what the state and local laws are going to require of you. In addition to sick leave, there are minimum wage requirements. You have to pay the most generous of all of the things. That's what I say. So if you have a sick leave requirement or a minimum wage requirement, you might have several. You might have a local minimum wage requirement, a state minimum wage requirement, a federal minimum wage requirement, an executive order minimum wage requirement under the FAR, as well as the prevailing wage rule. So you could have 5 minimum wage laws, and you have to figure out what applies. The most generous of them applies. Same with sick leave. You have to look at all of those sick leave obligations that you might have under state, local, and federal law. The federal law is really the federal contractor sick leave that applies to SCA and Davis-Bacon Act contracts. And look at the most generous provisions of each one. That's what you're going to apply. So your sick leave policy might not be the Washington state or, you know, Maryland sick leave law. It might be kind of a hodgepodge of the federal executive order sick leave requirements and the state requirements, because you have to take the most generous of each of the provisions of that law and apply it. So the most generous carryover, the most generous amount, all of those things, and in order to compile a sick leave policy that works for you. Many of you are multi-state employers, and you know, I get this question all the time, you know, but Nicole, I operate in 12 different states. I have some SCA folks, some non-SCA folks, some Davis-Bacon folks, some non-Davis-Bacon folks. You know, it is too onerous for me to apply, you know, 25 different provisions. So what I encourage companies to do in those cases is take a look at the jurisdictions they're operating in and think about just applying the most generous to their entire workforce. Obviously, that's a cost-benefit analysis. How much is that going to cost you? Is it going to take away your competitive edge? But it certainly does reduce the administrative burden. So we have to kind of, you know, compare what it would cost us to have a generally compliant policy, a 50-state compliant policy, and what it would cost you to administer several different policies. And companies come out in different places on that. So there's no right or wrong answer there, but the analysis really should be looked at to determine what's best for your organization and what you all do. It's really important to understand where people are going to be located. And this is important for a number of reasons. This is not where the contract is. So when I'm talking about looking at the laws that might apply to the workforce, a lot of companies will say, well, the base is located in Georgia, so I apply Georgia law. But then if you really look at it, there are a number of teleworkers that would be associated with that contract, or there are workforces that are going to be pieces of that workforce that might be located in different states. We're really, when we're looking at labor and employment law, we're looking at where folks are located. And that can be complicated because we have workforces that move. They might work for a short period of time in one state and then move to another state. You might have folks that are primarily located in Virginia, but then commute to do occasional work in Maryland. You know, nursing, paralegal contracts. There are a number of contracts where the workforce is relatively mobile. And that can create unique obligations under each state's laws, because each state's laws could apply in those situations. So even if somebody is spending, you know, an eighth of their time in Maryland, Maryland law attaches to that person. If you have teleworkers, the law of the state where they're teleworking is generally going to apply. So it's important that we don't just assume that the place of performance is where the contracting office is located. We have to look at, you know, if I hire a teleworker out of California, I'm now subjecting myself to California law with respect to that individual. And I might not want to do that. It might dissuade me from hiring that teleworker in California because of the onerous wage and hour requirements that attach to that particular worker. So again, there are lots of different components to considering state and local laws. And hopefully this is done well in advance of contract performance. But during performance, things are going to come up as well. Maybe you decide to hire somebody in a different state. Stop before that offer is made and think, okay, what is that hire going to obligate us to? And does it make sense to have to amend our handbook, put in place new policies in light of the fact that we have one teleworker in the state? Can we find that person in a state where we already have people? And so those considerations are important. Classification is, you know, a drum that I beat all the time, and I can't emphasize enough how important proper classification is. Classification is probably the #1 area where I see problems for contractors, and it's the #1 area where we see liability. And when I'm talking about liability, I'm not just talking about the Department of Labor audit, which will inevitably turn up something and cost you a lot of money. I'm also talking about class and collective actions regarding unpaid overtime, or under the Davis-Bacon Act, you can also sue under state laws as well. So it's really important that we understand and have justification for the classification decisions that we're making, because classifying incorrectly can be a big deal. So when I'm talking about classification, I'm talking about a number of different classification requirements. The first one is the Fair Labor Standards Act. So the Fair Labor Standards Act, as many of you probably know, is the federal law that establishes minimum wage and overtime for hourly workers. And I always like to start from the assumption when I'm classifying that everybody is hourly. Everybody is non-exempt hourly until they fit into an exemption box, okay? And so when, so I do that analysis first, and then I look at, okay, can this person fit into one of the many exemptions under the Fair Labor Standards Act, so that I'm not subject to either the minimum wage requirements and or the overtime requirements. The most common exemptions we think about are the administrative exemption, the professional exemption, the executive exemption, computer professionals, and then sometimes outside sales. So those are the most common, but there are exemptions for, folks working on ships and things like that. So there are a number of different exemptions for agriculture workers, seasonal workers, things like that. But the most common ones are the ones that I cited before. And in order to make somebody exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act, you have to meet both a salary test and a duties test. The salaries test is relatively easy. You have to, meet $633 a week as of January of this year. And it has to be paid on a salary basis, meaning you can't adjust it. This is what's hard for government contractors. You can't adjust it based on hours worked. And so when government contractors are thinking about their time and their billing in terms of timekeeping to the government, we're often thinking in terms of hours, right? But we need to make sure that we don't make any improper deductions, particularly when folks are taking leave. We need to make sure that they are taking, if they're exempt, that they're taking leave in full day absences for personal reasons. They're not working part of the day and then taking a part of the day unpaid. It's really, really critical that you're looking at a steady salary, meaning the employee is getting paid the same thing unless there are specific rules that govern deductions from pay. So what is the consequence if you don't classify folks correctly under the Fair Labor Standards Act? The result is that they can lose that exemption, and any overtime that that person worked in the last 2 years is, sometimes 3, is subject to be paid by the contractor. That's really expensive, folks. So where I see a lot of missteps in FLSA classification is military leave is not administered correctly. People run out of paid time off, so they're just entering leave without pay in the system for 2 hours here and 3 hours there. You're making those people hourly employees at that point. They're being treated hourly, and DOL is just gonna, or a plaintiff's attorney, frankly, is gonna seize on that. It's also really important because it kind of dovetails to the prevailing wage requirements. If you don't classify somebody correctly under the Fair Labor Standards Act, your chances are you're not going to classify them correctly for purposes of the Service Contract Act or the Davis-Bacon Act. And why is that? Because if you have a Service Contract Act contract or a Davis-Bacon Act contract, those wage and hour requirements only apply to people that are hourly or non-exempt. So it can, it's more costly generally to put people in an SCA or a DBA classification because of the extra benefits that they might get. And so the temptation is to push into exemptions, right? To make people salaried so that you don't have to worry about those pesky prevailing wage laws. That's the top type of DOL investigation I get right now is misclassification. So it's really important that you understand how to classify exempt and non-exempt. And Brian, I have a handout on FLSA exemptions. If anybody's interested in it, we can either send it out after the fact. I can attach it somewhere, whatever the best way to do that is. But it's a nice flow chart that kind of tells people how to classify. So we'll figure out a way to push that out to you all later.
Yeah, Nicole, we'll you'll have that, all the contact information of the registrants and attendees, and you'll be able to distribute that. I've seen it really, really great. So look forward to that.
Great. So that's my homework to you is, and my commitment to you is that I will get that sent out to you all after the webinar today. Independent contractors are another area that I see misclassified all the time, and it cuts in two different ways. The first way is that government contractors want to push people into independent contractor positions because it's cheaper for them to do that, and so they want to push people in that direction. The other thing that we see is that there's a workforce that's an incumbent workforce that's on site. They've always operated as independent contractors, and they don't want to be your employees, but you need them because the client likes them. So we kind of say, well, we don't really think that you qualify as an independent contractor, but I'm going to make some exceptions because, I really need you. The client really wants you, and you're not going to come to work for me unless you can be an independent contractor. The problem with misclassifying independent contractors is that if Department of Labor comes in, they're going to then make you convert them to employees, and they could, again, be eligible for all of that overtime. If the IRS gets involved and there's a memorandum of understanding between the IRS and Department of Labor, which means that if the Department of Labor finds an independent contractor issue, they send a note over to IRS that says, hey guys, there's something you might want to take a look at. And then IRS audits you and finds that you owe some taxes. Other ways that this comes up in terms of claims is unemployment. Although right now, independent contractors are supposed to be eligible for unemployment currently, but we don't expect that to last forever. And going backwards, that wasn't the case. So expect that, some independent contractors, they get laid off or terminated. They go out and apply for unemployment and they claim that they're employees, not independent contractors. Or you get into a tiff, an argument with one of them, and all of a sudden they're in a plaintiff's attorney's office and the plaintiff's attorney says to them, wait, you're an independent contractor? How could it be that you're an independent contractor and you're sitting at a cubicle right next to a guy that does the same thing as you, but is an employee? All right? That's really hard to justify if you're an employer. So it's really important that you take a look at the test for independent contractors. I will tell you right now, in Massachusetts and California, it's almost impossible to work for government contractor and be an independent contractor. The test that those states employ for independent contractors is very, very high, and it basically is that if you are doing work on a contract and the government contractor, or any business, it's in their primary line of business. And for government contractors, your primary line of business is the government contract, right? And so if you're working on that government contract, it's really difficult to show that that independent contractor is working out of your mainstream line of business, which is essentially what you have to show. In California, that rule is retroactive. So their, the equivalent of their kind of IRS is actively auditing companies going back, and contractors are so easy to find because you have all these nice little, reportable contracts that are out there, and so you're easy to find. So if you have folks that are independent contractors in California or Massachusetts, be very, very careful. I would encourage you to seek counsel to make sure that you're doing that correctly. And then in other states, there's kind of this ongoing attack on whether people can be independent contractors or not. It's really important right now, it's under a lot of scrutiny, that you spend some time on thinking about who can be independent contractors, and don't make the assumption that folks are going to be because your industry has always worked this way or something like that, because Department of Labor doesn't care, how your industry has always worked. And so it's important that you have that rationale kind of set somewhere, that you've thought about it. That also dovetails with the Prevailing Wage Act requirements. So I'm going to just briefly talk about prevailing wage, but the thing I wanted to say about independent contractors and prevailing wage is that they qualify for prevailing wage. So classifying somebody as an independent contractor is not going to get you out of prevailing wage requirements. So if you have a Service Contract Act contract or a Davis-Bacon Act contract, those are still going to apply to independent contractors, which is really important. Classification under prevailing wage requirements is a little bit different. So first we need to make sure people fall under one of these rules. The Service Contract Act applies to service workers, so janitorial, secretarial, some tech and computer professionals, gardeners. There's a SCA directory of occupations that covers, you know, hundreds of, probably 100 or more classifications of individuals that would fall under this act. You'll know if the SCA applies to you because the FAR provisions will be in the contract and a wage determination should be in the contract, or a collective bargaining agreement would be in the contract. The Davis-Bacon Act applies to construction, maintenance, repair. Again, you should have FAR provisions in your contract and a wage determination. Hopefully you've thought about these before you bid on them, because they're, you know, I do 2-day trainings just on the SCA and the DBA. So this is not a, oh, no big deal, we'll just pay people what the wage determination says. You have a list of classifications in not only your contract that tells you what folks probably should be doing, or gives you a statement of work that tells you how you need, what you need to do to meet the deliverables. But then you also have these wage determinations that say, okay, once you determine somebody as an hourly employee, then they have to fit in one of these classifications. And you have to be able to map the statement of work and what people will be doing to one of these classifications. That's not always an easy thing to do. That is the requirement of the contractor. So even if the contracting officer tells you, oh, I think these guys should be general clerk 3s, or I think these guys should be skilled laborers, that's not going to matter at the end of the day, because the obligation is on the contractor to correctly classify. And the government is generally not going to pick up the tab if you classify folks incorrectly. It's a highly specific area, and something you should be spending a lot of time on and not making assumptions about. We do SCA webinars and Davis-Bacon Act webinars frequently. We have one coming up next week that's dovetailing some of the new leave requirements with the SCA and the DBA. So we will send that information out to you as well if you're interested in learning more about the SCA and DBA. All right, so try to be mindful of time. So I always like to kind of talk about what it's like to be the new kid in town, and by that I mean the new contractor on site. It is a special place to be, and you're only there for a few minutes. And the way that you interface with employees, the contracting office, your subcontractors, during those initial few days, weeks, during that transition period can really set the tone for how your contract is going to go. If you have a bad onboarding or transition experience with your people, that's going to stick around probably for a long period of time. Some contractors might be in a business where you don't think it matters that much, and maybe it doesn't. But many of the large-scale investigations that we get come from bad transitions. Employees don't trust you. They want to make your life a living hell, and they feel like they've been cheated or robbed in some way, shape, or form. And this is often the result of, you bid this thing to win, and maybe they had received raises with the last contractor. Maybe they were making more money for some reason with the last contractor. You had no idea, you might not have any idea what these people are making. And then you walk on board, you get on board, and then all of a sudden you have to tell people they're going to have to take a pay cut, which is not sitting well with them, right? And then on top of that, maybe you don't understand fully the SCA obligations. They don't feel like they're getting the right SCA vacation. Maybe their last contractor was just doing it all wrong, and now you're coming in and doing it right, and they're suspicious because they're like, hey, it's different than the last guy. So trying to do some intel on the front end to understand what it's going to be like going in is really, really critical. So the first thing I want to talk about is understanding your successor obligation. So the new contractor is often considered a successor under a number of different laws. The National Labor Relations Act, USERRA, which governs military leave, and the Family and Medical Leave Act. And so what does that mean? It means that under these laws, you might have certain obligations to your workforce, and you don't want to get sideways with them. I'll briefly talk about the NLRA, and that's governed by the National Labor Relations Board. So there's the NLRA, which is the act, and then you'll see the acronym here, NLRB, which is the board that makes the decisions regarding whether or not you've complied. Most of you guys are probably thinking, well, that applies to union workforces, so I don't have to worry about it. But every employer still has obligations under the NLRA to make sure that people can talk about their terms and conditions of employment and aren't squashed. So if you walk on board and you say, hey, this is your offer and it's confidential and you can't share it with any other employee on site, you're violating the NLRA and you're violating the FAR provision regarding an employee's right to communicate with other employees. There are lots of different ways that you can encourage people to keep things a little bit close to vest without actually violating a law. And so you don't, I hate seeing emails that go out that say you are not allowed to talk about your compensation with anybody, because we can't do that. We can't require that. And it's just used to publicize how awful you are on the back end, even if all of your intentions were very good, right? So I look at all of this in terms of how it can be spun later on, even when a contractor has the best of intentions, because that's usually when I'm seeing it. You also have an obligation if there was a unionized workforce on site and you are taking over a contract. There are also certain obligations on how to transition that contract. And you can't discriminate against people for being union members when you're hiring. You've got to make clear what terms and conditions of employment you're putting in place. Again, if you have not worked with a unionized workforce before or are uncomfortable in any way, shape, or form with that transition, I would highly encourage you to seek counsel, because what you do in those very first minutes can make a huge financial difference to you down the road. USERRA, that's military leave. And what do I mean by that? If somebody is on military leave with the prior contractor and you take over the contract, you can be deemed a successor, which means when that person comes back from their military leave, they might be entitled to a job with you, even though you've never employed them before. Crazy, right? So it's really important that you're looking and asking those questions when you're when you're onboarding, whether there might be anybody out on military leave that you need to be thinking about. The same goes to some extent with FMLA, which is the Family Medical Leave Act. You have obligations as a successor employer to take people's length of service with a prior contractor into consideration for eligibility for Family and Medical Leave Act. So for example, you take on 4 people from an incumbent contractor. One of them is pregnant. So she wants to go out and take her family and medical leave. Assuming you qualify because you're 50 employees within a 75-mile radius, even though that person's only worked with you for a month, she will be eligible for family and medical leave because she has a tenure of at least 12 months with the prior contractor. And I think that gets missed a lot, and then it gets us into trouble with the FMLA. So there are a number of successor obligations. It's just really important that you keep in mind that you could be a successor under these particular laws as well. For SCA vacation, you have successor obligations, meaning that, we're talking about anniversary dates, and the way that the service contract vacation works is that a person gets a contract service date, their anniversary date. And that is the first date they worked on any contract, on this contract at this location for any contractor. So you can walk on and a person might have 10 years under their belt, right? They get their vacation amount, vacation allotment based on that tenure. So you need to make sure you understand anniversary dates, which can be hard to find. So the questions I get there are usually, nobody gave me a list of anniversary dates. What can I do? I'll just make it the new contract start date. Don't do that. You need to go back and ask employees to fill out applications, do employment verification, just like we normally would do employment verification, and see if you can pin down that date as close as you possibly But you can't just ignore that somebody's been working on a prior contract. You want to look at non-compete and non-solicitation agreements. So normally when and these are state-specific laws, but you want to be asking people if they had any obligations which might limit their ability to work on a new contract. Most of the time, non-competes are not enforceable once the old contract ends, but it's very fact-specific. And so it's important that you understand if anybody you're bringing on has restrictions and how that might impact your contract. It's particularly important during transition periods. So if you're hiring people away while the other contractor is still working, you might have some issues there, and you want to be very careful about that. You also want to be careful during, the bidding phase, and when you're going out to look for opportunities, that you're not inducing people to violate their duties of loyalty to their current employer or their non-compete or non-solicitation agreements, because you're going to get wrapped into that if there's a claim. So we want to make sure that we understand obligations there. Don't assume the predecessor got it right. The number one thing I hear from contractors is that we did our intel and the predecessor was classifying everybody as exempt, or the predecessor had, was doing it this way, so we're just doing it the same way, and we shouldn't get in trouble because that's how the predecessor did it. Well, that's not a good excuse. That's like saying, my brother did it, why can't I do it? And your mom is like, no, sorry, right? So you've got to look at it's a good intel to have. It will give you a lot of information about what you might be facing when you walk on site, but don't rely on it as a basis for things like classifying people or pricing or things like that. It's just a good thing to understand. Good intel, don't rely on it. Also be prepared to question what the government client tells you. There's a reason why, contractors are hired to come in and be more efficient, to think differently about how to perform if you have a contract where you can kind of move the pieces around a little bit. But don't assume that the intel you're getting from a contracting officer about how things are run or how people should be classified or how people should be paid are correct. Again, that's not something you can rely on in investigation or legal. So you don't want to rely too heavily on it and then get in trouble. If it's in writing, if it's actually in the contract, and then you get in trouble, for example, I've had a few contracts where it's specifically said in the contract that the workforce is exempt and you are supposed to classify these people under the SCA as X, or you're supposed to classify them in the Davis-Bacon Act as Y. Pretty unusual, but if it happens, doesn't mean you're not going to get in trouble with the contracting officer or with the Department of Labor, I'm sorry. But you might have a basis to go back and ask the government for an adjustment if they made it a part of your contract because it was a contractual obligation. But again, these are all really fact specific. So if you see something in a solicitation that you question to be correct, we should be addressing it way far in advance if we can. Okay, so let's talk about making offers of employment really quick, because there are some things that you can think about here that can save you a lot of time and heartache down the road. You want to have a game plan when you're onboarding people, particularly when you know that you are not going to be offering as much money or you're going to be changing classifications of folks. If you know that before you walk on board, you are going to, and you have a game plan for talking to people about those decisions, you are going to be in a much better position to fend off a Department of Labor investigation. So instead of having just, somebody walk on and say, here's your new hourly rate, and it's $3 an hour less than you made before, and by the way, we're not giving you any benefits, and just have a good day, right? They're going to start questioning, hey, why is this working that way? And this isn't fair. And then they come to you and they say, hey, why am I getting paid $3 an hour less? Oh, I'm classified differently. Why am I classified differently? And you're going to say, because this is the way that somebody told me I had to classify you, which is not going to be very satisfying. And they're just going to go to the Department of Labor, right? So if you have a game plan when you're onboarding people, you can explain to them, we're not going to have you do exactly what the last contractor did. This is what we're going to be having you do. This is why you're in a different classification. And this is the job we have for you, but at least people can start to understand that you thought about it and that you're not trying to get the same thing. Doesn't mean they're going to be happy about it, right? I'm not trying to tell you they're going to walk away and say, thank you. But at least they have some understanding of why those decisions were made and what their options are going forward. You want to think about security clearance concerns, whether there's any processing that'll have to occur for security clearances, whether there's going to be any issues related to that security clearance that might prohibit somebody from getting on site when you need them to get on site. So one complaint I often get is, I'm going to have to clear this person. Like this position requires a public trust clearance or a secret clearance. And these things take a long time. So when I make offers of employment, I am going to ask people, about their, whether they're United States citizens, and I'm going to ask them about whether they have any debts or whether they have a criminal background, because I want to make sure that they're going to be able to clear that process. And because that process is expensive and it takes a long time, things like that. You want to be careful about timing of some of those questions. Some of those questions are just plain not okay to ask before you make offers of employment. And even when you make the offer of employment, you want to be careful about how you're running that through the system. So to make sure you avoid any claims that you discriminated against somebody on the basis of their U.S. citizenship. You might be very, very confident that they are not going to clear that process, but there are certain questions that we can't ask that the folks responsible for security clearances can ask, right? So we still have to be very careful about how we're asking those questions and what we ask and how we ask it. Use your offer letter to include appropriate contingencies. So if you haven't been awarded the contract yet, make sure that you're including contingencies for if the government accepts your position. You always want to have at-will language in your offer letters. And one of the areas where I see folks go wrong in offer letters is that somebody really needs to just get this hire. Like, we've got to get them in the door, we've got to place them. And so they do that, and then somebody pops like a $10,000 signing bonus in a letter, but doesn't make that signing bonus contingent upon 90 days of performance or whatever the case might be. And on day 5, that person turns out to be a nightmare. You still owe that person the $10,000 because you didn't put any contingencies. You didn't put any meat around those bones on what it meant. So you really want to be careful about how you're changing your standard offer letters and making sure that it's not obligating you to things that you didn't intend to be obligated to. We never want our offer letters really to be contracts of any type. We want separate documents for contracts. In our offer letters, if you have a big enough workforce, you might want to consider some notification under the WARN Act that the employment term is only expected to be as long as the contract opportunity. This will save us some time on the back end if we lose the contract or we have to do mass layoffs, that we have advised people in advance that their employment was not intended to be long-term. So that can have some benefits under the WARN Act as well. And I think this is our last slide. The last thing we want to talk about is really embracing what's unique about government contracting and learning how to live with it, right? Because there are just some things that are unique to government contractors that are an absolute pain and create challenges for us. The first one of those is government removals. At some point in time in your tenure, somebody's going to come to you from the government and say, we don't like Joe anymore, we want him gone. And you're going to say, but Joe just put in a request for a disability leave, or Joe just told me you were harassing him, or Joe just told, or Mary just told you she was pregnant. Now you don't want her there anymore, right? And so there are going to be times where we have to decide the level of pushback. How much do we need to push back? How much do we need to paper? And obviously it's a client relations concern, but we also want to put you in a good position that if that employee files a claim, you can say, look, we investigated the complaint. We tried to push the request for accommodation through to the government. We warned the government that, you know, you had just advised that you were pregnant. We did everything we could to keep you. And then insert results, right? So we really want to be careful about government removals and not just rely on, well, the government said we had to let you go, so we let you go. Maybe that is the end result, but there are some interim steps that you need to take to protect yourselves. But there's a lot in FAR Part 22. We have a webinar up on our website at claremassa.com that kind of walks through everything that's in FAR Part 22 and part of 23. There's, you know, I read through it at least a couple of times a year because that's what I do. And it never ceases to amaze me that there are things in there that I've forgotten about or haven't thought about in a while, and it's just good to keep in mind. So I would highly encourage you to peruse it at some point. You can Google it. Just look at what's in there. I will say that the non-displacement of qualified workers, I mentioned that a little bit earlier. I put an asterisk here because it's still in the FAR, but it's been revoked. So you're going to see it there. You might even see it in your contracts, but it's not there anymore. You don't have the same obligation to hire the incumbent workforce if you're an SCA employer as you did before. And then you have all of these OFCCP requirements, and these are the equal employment opportunity requirements. They include all the Title VII stuff. They don't really include age. Age isn't included in the OFCCP requirements for some reason, but all the other protected classes are. They've also added gender, sexual orientation and gender identity to it. There are, you know, obligations to hire and recruit veterans and those with disabilities that are different from commercial folks working in the commercial industry. So it's really important that you think about, you know, what I have to do. And if you're around 50 employees or you think you're going to take on a contract that's 50 employees or more, you really should be thinking about, you know, what extra obligations are going to attach once you hit 50, because you need an affirmative action plan at 50 employees. So I don't know if we have questions. I can keep going to the end, Brian, but I wanted to leave some time for questions.
There are actually a couple of questions. So first was to clarify where, and I think you might have addressed this, but it's worth just revisiting since the question was asked. To clarify, quote, where people will be located, quote, does this refer to the state of residence or the state where the work will be performed?
Where the state where the work will be performed. So again, that's an extra complication. You can have somebody, for example, in construction, this is very common. You can have somebody who resides in Idaho, but is working for 3 months in Utah and 4 months in California, and they kind of hop around project to project. You're going to apply the labor and employment laws of the state where they're working.
Good. And then let's see, is there a reference document I can review that provides an overview of potential impacts of misclassification? I want to paint the picture to my leadership of negative impacts to misclassifications and how serious and important it is.
Let me see, a reference document. So I would look at the Fair Labor Standards Act reference sheets on the Department of Labor website. That might be a good resource. They often outlay different impacts there. You could also look at, Google I didn't really address this much here, but it's on this list of FAR Part 22 stuff, the Contract Work Hours and Safety Standards Act. That is the law for government contractors that imposes additional monies due to employees if you get overtime wrong. So if you misclassify somebody as exempt when they should be non-exempt, you not only have to pay the overtime, but you have to pay damages, $25 a day on top of that, and that's specific to government contractors. So if you Google that, there are articles that come up. Shoot me an email too. I'll try to think of some others. But those would be good places to start, and hopefully the flow chart I send out will also help with that. But certainly I understand that's a struggle to explain to leadership the importance of classification.
Those are the only two that we have now. I mean, we do have about maybe 5 minutes or so left. So if there are questions, please feel free to add them to the question queue. If not, I'll turn it back to you, Nicole, to see if you have additional items that you wanted
Sure.
to.
Yeah. The only other thing, my colleague Sarah would kind of beat me up if, I think she talked about that when we met in January for the SHRM event, Brian. But the only other thing I would like to add is the Drug-Free Workplace Act requirements. So more and more we're getting questions about, does the Drug-Free Workplace Act require me to pre-employment drug test everybody? And the short answer from our position, an actual just legal requirement, is that it doesn't require you to pre-employment drug test everybody. It requires you to have a policy that requires people when they're working not to be engaged in the use, distribution, sale of any illegal drugs or misuse of prescription medications, right? So then the employer has this added layer of decision making to do as to whether you will engage pre-employment drug screening or not. Some people take the position that it's still really important to do. I think that it's dependent on your workforce. More and more I'm getting calls from employers that are saying, look, I have an office space. People are smoking pot in Colorado and Washington and DC and everywhere, and I can't hire people to fill these, you know, roles that usually are filled by people just entering the workforce. And as long as they're not coming to work high, I really don't care. You know, so you have to look at the workforce. Do you have safety sensitive positions? Do you have cleared positions? Does the contract require it? And everybody should be taking a look at their drug-free workplace policies, because the policy that just gets stuck in a handbook and never gets looked at for 10 years. And it's worth updating. There are a number of cases right now at the state level that are questioning whether the use of medical marijuana shouldn't be allowed as a reasonable accommodation for a disability as long as somebody's not high at work. That generally doesn't apply, in most states doesn't apply to government contractors, but it's really important that, you know, for a lot of different reasons, for pricing, because drug testing costs money. You know, do you want to move to just accident and reasonable suspicion testing? So really take a look at the workforce, the type of work that you're performing, and determine if you need to make some changes. It can save you in some recruiting headaches. It can save you some time, but certainly there's no right answer to it. It's just something that's coming up more and more in our practice, and employers are concerned about running afoul of their requirements under the Drug-Free Workplace Act. But there is some flexibility there. We just really have to look at the organization. So that's the last thing I think I would throw into everything we've talked about.
Good. Well, it doesn't look like we have additional questions. I've got a couple of closing items, and then we'll finish up. I'm going to go ahead and stop your share on this.
Perfect.
And so two quick things. One is, as you're exiting out, you'll be prompted for a survey. On average, from what I've seen, it takes about 60 seconds. So if you can give me 60 seconds of your time after this and complete that, I'd be grateful for it. And then this has been recorded. It's recorded locally. So kind of the mechanism for distribution as of now will be through my humble insurance YouTube channel. So with that, I'll just give you a kind of some direction on that, where it will ultimately end up. So while I am a Gen Xer, it is called insurancing. So I've got a little bit of millennial going on there. And if you go to YouTube and Google that, you will, and I'll take you there in a second. One, I will note, I've only seen 2 episodes of this. This guy's pretty good. If you haven't seen some good news, check it out.
Great.
So if you go to insurancing, you'll find that wonderful headshot of mine with short hair, which does not exist now. And I did a bunch of webinars recently that are out there. Feel free to take a look at these. Maybe a little bit dated now because we're kind of through some of the really pressure points that were there, but it'll be up here probably sometime tomorrow. I've got to pull everything down, then push everything up. I will have a link in tomorrow's. You'll get kind of a post-webinar email And the link for that will be in there as well. But if you are really excited to watch this again this evening, it should be up there sometime shortly after normal business hours. And with that, I'll give you back 1 minute. Nicole, do you have anything to say? Any things you're doing soon?
No, just thank you so much for having me. It was fun. It's been an interesting world adjusting. I'm sure everybody has to all of the remote stuff, but I'm glad that we've been able to kind of seamlessly transition, at least with this stuff. It's a nice break for me. So appreciate you all joining me today and having me.
Great. Excellent. Thank you all for your time, and have a great week. Have a great day.